Hey, everybody, welcome back to Mac Mike. And our guest this week is Vlad. Vlad is a former uh, citizen of Ukraine and Russia. Then, when he was a teenager, came to the United States and joined the U.S. Army. And we've had him on before, but we're bringing him on to get the perspective of somebody who has relatives and loved ones in both of those countries. And the current negotiations, which are just breaking on the news, I guess, is Donald Trump will be having some kind of start to the talks next week. And Zelenskyy is not really happy about this because I guess the American point of view at this time for peace talks is that we're not inviting in the Europeans or others because in previous discussions, they've all fallen apart because of having too many people present. It's like too many cooks in the kitchen. But anyway, Vlad, you've written on this subject on your Twitter feed. And just for a moment, I'd like you to share your thoughts.
Well, I actually have a ton of thoughts, and I made some notes here. But if I were to go over them one by one, I think we'd be here for the entire 2 hours. So I was hoping maybe you could ask me some questions of what you're thinking, and I could clarify from my perspective. But as you have mentioned, yes, I was born in Ukraine, and for a large part of my young upbringing, I was raised in Russia. I do have family on both sides of in both countries and on both sides of this conflict. Um, and I have served in U.S. Army. I was served with 1st Cavalry Division, and I was in Iraq from '06 to '08 and then 9 to 10. So this is a very dear to me topic because in the end of the day, we're still talking about the people which are, well, historically Rus people. Um, and these are all my people. They're all my Slavic people, which are part of my family and my upbringing.
Well, I did discover that the popularity of Putin is really high in Russia right now. It's listed to be 78 to 80%. Now, the argument there is because it's a totalitarian system, few people would speak out against him. However, my thought is even if those numbers are way skewed, his popularity among his people is probably equal to Donald Trump's right now, which is at 53%. So he has a pretty strong mandate. However, Zelensky's popularity has dropped to around 22%. So it looks like Zelensky's losing the popularity, but I'm not sure that that's as important when it comes to the peace talks. What are your views on how the peace talks should proceed?
All right. Well, before I answer that, let me address this part about the popularity. Um, uh, you cannot talk about it without this talking about the statement he just made today. And in particularly, Zelensky said that Ukrainians oppose the elections and those who don't should leave. And that was just today. And he so said, and I will actually quote here, had it written down, we need unity during wartime. If some Ukrainians don't like the absence of elections, they can choose a different citizenship. That's what he said today. Now, I'm thinking back on this, and I'm thinking about something that I have heard Tulsi Gabbard say just a couple of days ago on this point. And it's impossible for me, in my mind, to reconcile his statement without her statement. And I'm paraphrasing, but essentially, she said Zelensky proponents support the suspension of elections because of war. Okay, well, if that's the case, now let's stop and think for a second. If we accept that excuse as a criteria for suspension of constitution and suspension of elections, then we should presume that election representatives in our own country will also use the same excuse and rationale when they suspend, well, our constitution and our elections. Okay, so we're talking about popularity. I think this is what it really boils down to right now, is because the Ukrainian people are tired of sending their young men to die. and this conflict, and they're also tired of the control that, as you know, the martial law has been enacted in 22nd of February in 2022. Well, it's a funny date, right? So, but since that, then Ukraine has banned like pretty much all the opposing parties and even the most widespread religion, which is Ukrainian Orthodoxy. Um, and I can go in the detail on that. But the point is, it's been oppressed. Priests have been and ministers have been jailed. It's and Ukrainian Orthodoxy has ties to Russia from its very beginning, and they of course don't forget that they seized full control of all the major national media. So it is something that is inevitably becoming a big reason of why he is not popular. Because first you went into people's homes and families and said, what you have been worshiping historically for generations, you're no longer worshiping. It's no longer a Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is UOC, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which historically has Russian Orthodox ties, the ROC, but it has now become OCU, Orthodox Church of Ukraine, because of Zelensky push to separate faith from anything that has historically been Russian. And a big part of that is OCU is technically ran under, Constantinople, Orthodox Church of Constantinople, which is in modern day Istanbul. Everybody remember the song?
Yeah.
The song Istanbul was Constantinople, right? So
Yeah.
So it is very funny how from modern day Turkey, the present day Orthodox Russian Christianity is being ran, and people are not having it. They're not happy with this. And I'm speaking even from my own family who do support Zelensky. I do have family over there who does, although majority of my Ukrainian family does not. But even the family that does have a big problem with that because they feel like their identity has been slowly stripped away from them.
Well,
So we're talking,
how do you think that plays into the potential of peace talks and compromise?
oh man, as far as compromise, this is a whole other topic here. I mean, if we want to look at how this actually could go down compromise wise, okay. Here's my point. Ukraine was never meant to win this war. It was always a money laundering scheme for Western elites. Um, and if you look at the regions like Luhansk and Donetsk that have been Russian identified regions for decades, functionally, like between, I'd say 2014, NATO always knew Ukraine couldn't join with, a territorial dispute like this. So if we really want to think about this, the corruption and the money laundering allegations, they're not anything new for Ukraine, but they have become rather impossible to ignore. As the reports now show that half of the money that USAID, right, and others sent to Ukraine is missing or misplaced. And at the same time, Donald Trump is asking for the return on that investment in resources, right?
Right,
So
but then
meanwhile,
Zelensky wants security guarantees, and
right,
anything short of NATO, there are other ways to give him security guarantees if, say, the European Union wants to do that, or a number of particular countries. They could create a sort of, like France is suggesting, a European army, because it looks
right,
like they're afraid that the United States is pulling out of NATO, which we are not. We're just using our leverage to get them to pony up more money. But again, I'm sort of interested because it seems like there is an uncompromising position with Donetsk and what's the other one?
Luhansk.
Luhansk. They want those back, but it is true that most of those people speak Russian, have Russian cultural. There was a referendum that was like 92% of those people wanted to have Russia rule them. Now, the argument is that was given under pressure because the Russian army had at that time actually been in those regions. And the argument is they were coerced. I don't believe that you can come up with a 92% vote, even on a coercion. So I do think the majority of people in those regions want to belong to Russia or at least have some type of autonomy to themselves where they can be, either capitulate and work with Russia or Ukraine, whatever benefits them at the particular time, especially like having their own police force, judges, lawyers, and business dealings. So that seems to be an intractable position. What are your thoughts? Do you think Russia would ever give up those regions and let them be sort of autonomous?
Well, actually, Mike, they're already autonomous. Russia didn't claim those places as a part of Russian Federation. Luhansk and Donetsk were given, full autonomy, and they are their own sovereign nations on bordering Russia. Now, how does that work in reality? I don't know. I mean, I can't tell you. It's like us annexing Mexico, installing a new government in there, and saying, well, now you have full autonomy. I cannot tell you how that really works in that regard, but essentially that's exactly what happened in Ukraine to begin with in 2014, was removal of Yanukovsky. But um, just a couple points on this. Like, if you really want to look back at like Cuban Missile Crisis, right, and like the reasons why Ukraine could never be a part of NATO. I know you didn't ask that, but it's like a lot of people do not know like what's a big deal with Ukraine joining NATO, right? And one of the core reasons Ukraine could never be NATO nation is without risking World War III. That is, it boils down to the ICBMs and NATO's nuclear posture. I mean, Ukraine joining NATO would force Russia to likely to escalate to nuclear war because the alternative would be, well, accepting loss of strategic deterrence. And U.S. faces dilemma again during Cuban Missile Crisis, and we nearly went to war over it.
Yeah,
Expecting Russia to react differently is like either naive or it's an elaborate, deliberate provocation.
we discussed that last time we had you on, Vlad. That's a good point. Uh, it would be difficult. I don't think it would escalate to nuclear war necessarily. It might, but the I don't think NATO is ever going to accept Ukraine. I know that's a big hot topic in the news, but
You
I just
mentioned
don't think it's going to happen. What do you think, Mac? What are your thoughts?
you mentioned that. You mentioned NATO. Pete Hegseth, who is the new SecDef, said Ukraine will never be part of NATO. He said that yesterday. So
Yeah.
there's already some movement on the position of the United States. And very honestly, as Vlad helped us understand previous conversations, the Ukraine and NATO was one of the primary reasons that pushed Putin and Russia to their posture of invading Ukraine. There were other reasons, but that was an important one. The comparison to the Cuban Missile Crisis is absolutely appropriate. I'd like to ask Vlad this. Vlad, I didn't understand the religious aspect of this, but religion obviously is a very important, very personal matter. Here's the question I'll set up the question this way. Um, the United States, in the form of President Trump, called Vladimir Putin to try to end this war. He called Putin first. Zelensky was upset by that. He called Zelensky second, but Zelensky was put off by the fact that Trump first called Russia. I will tell you that the government of UK, the government of Germany, whoever's in charge of the EU, all three of them basically supported Zelensky when he said there will be no peace if Ukraine is not at the negotiating table. So I guess what I'm trying to ask, and maybe you do or don't know, is I don't think Ukraine is capable of prosecuting a war against Russia without the United States aid. in weapons and money, etc. You already mentioned some of that. I don't think Europe is in a position. There is no European army yet. I don't think Europe is in a position to be able to support Ukraine against Russia. So what I'm really asking is if the United States in the form of President Trump and Russia in the form of President Putin negotiate a peace treaty of some kind, whether that includes territory being given to Russia or not, whether that includes Ukraine being part of NATO, which I think is off the table, will Zelenskyy and Ukraine accept that peace treaty if they are in fact not included at the table when negotiations occur? Because the Europeans seem to support Zelensky's claim, if we're not at the table, we're not taking the deal.
I do not believe it's actually going to come to this. Look, Trump's approach was contacting Russia first is rooted in, how do you say this in English? Realism, okay, and not appeasement. And it's another thing about this is, well, Russia is a nuclear superpower. Uh, if we are trying to prevent a global catastrophe and de-escalate tensions, I think the people who matter in this equation the most are the people who can do damage, right? And the people who are our potential allies going forward. Because if you really want to think about the split of the world right now between, U.S. and our allies, and the opposite spectrum, which would be BRICS, right? Then this is the people that we need to have a conversation with and hash out the details with them first, saying like, listen, we all want to end this, right? So, and then have the people who do not have the say so in this, essentially, is what Mike has said in the beginning of the conversation, is the EU. And Ukraine, of course, has a role and conversation to be played as this, but they are to be contacted last, at least in my opinion, about this, is quite frankly because their opinion, their regime's opinion at this point doesn't truly matter. Here's why. Where is it going to get support to fight? If we're pulling money from them, because we are,
Right.
We are pulling resources and weapons from them, which we are. Where are they going to ask for support? If NATO is not going to be involved, it does really truly falls on European nations. And are they prepared to commit and carry the burden financial on their own citizens? You know what? I would like to see it. Let them do it, because their own people will revolt from that. And maybe it's a part of larger Trump strategy. If European Union does want to get involved and send their armies and their sons to die, how would those nations react now that there is not a cushy blanket and U.S. support? Okay. At the same time, the way we're looking at this is this Ukraine suspended, as for what I said before, the elections, they took control of the media. At this point, they are, staying in power for the sake of self-preservation.
Yes.
So
And it's hard for me as an American to believe that the United States of America is willing to support a nation that has suspended elections. That doesn't
right.
sound like a democracy to me.
Right. And again, like, this is what I said. I mean, I get the argument, like, oh, you know what, because we are in a stable war period. But again, what Tulsi Gabbard has said, it really does resonate with me, because if we allow that there and we support that there, we're supporting that everywhere, including up to in our own nation. And we can't have that. We can't stand for that. And at the same time, not only NATO joining, or rather allowing Ukraine to join, would be a disaster, because it's potentially escalating the new Cuban Missile Crisis type scenario. But at the same time, it sends a message that NATO is inherently biased and geopolitically opposed to Russia by default, because Ukraine is having territorial disputes with ethnic people of that land. NATO can't have that in both regards. So it is very clear that Ukraine doesn't have a future as is, and it is at the mercy of the deal that is going to be made. As much as I hate saying that, but that's just the cold reality. And that's Trump's approach, was like your question in why call Russia first. It's rooted in realism.
Many Europe are saying that's appeasement, but I get your point. You're right, Vlad. You're calling it right. It's not appeasement. It's realist to understand that there is no deal unless Russia decides to stop the uh, warring actions on their part.
Yeah, I just
At the
Googled
same,
something quick. I just wanted to let everybody that's listening know that even the United States suspended elections during the Civil War in some states. So it's not an uncommon thing to suspend elections. We even had a little blip during World War II. And of course, with COVID, we had a lot of changes. So I don't know how that necessarily plays into it. Maybe, Vlad, maybe you know, does the Ukrainian constitution allow Zelensky to suspend elections during
yes,
war?
it does.
Was that where he got the power from, or did he just make that up out of whole cloth?
No, the Constitution actually allows, and same goes in Russia, although that has never happened, at least not to my knowledge. Do not quote me on that. But the Constitution of Ukraine does, in fact, allow you to suspend elections, and it is really good approach to, sorry, a really good point that you're making, Mike, was that in fact, we had this, our Constitution suspended during Civil War. And from what you're saying, even momentarily during World War II, I'm definitely going to have to research this. I think this is a very interesting point that you're making, and I was not
I'll
aware of
say
that.
this: Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran for re-election during World War II and was elected.
Yeah, but there's something I didn't get to read at all that happened then. And of course, if you didn't know it, Abraham Lincoln was guilty of suspending habeas corpus. So that was actually a big constitutional crisis. All I'm
Was
saying is during wartime, it's not unusual for even Western countries to take extreme actions when it comes to elections. But the question is, how is it going to affect peace? And I think, Vlad, you're correct when you say um, you have to go to Russia first. I mean, there's just no doubt here. When you imagine getting between a husband and wife fighting, you want to first put them off in their own room and go talk to one of them first. You can't talk to them at the same time. Now, eventually, you will bring them to the same table, but you've got to sort of find out. Okay, like you said, Vlad, Russia is a superpower with nuclear weapons. Let's talk to them first, see where we can get them. You know, we kind of know what Ukraine is looking for. And then we say, okay, we bring this over to Ukraine. Ukraine talks to us, and we're kind of the middleman so that these two parties don't blow up at each other in a meeting and just say, that's it, we're done. And then they walk out. That's what happens too many times, I think, in negotiations.
the
Right.
first
And
of these negotiations going to occur in Saudi Arabia. I think that that's a very interesting choice of locations to begin negotiations. And I do believe that it's Trump's intention that once a deal is made, that the United States is walking away and leaving the deal implementation and the payment and the protection, etc., to the Russians on one side and the Ukrainians and the European Union on the other side. We're not going to be the forward going sugar daddy.
I think you're right.
Yep.
I have very different perspective on to add to this. When we're talking about, have you seen this trilateral proposition that Trump has made?
No.
Uh, Trump has made trilateral proposition to cutting all the military spending from
Yes.
China, Russia, and United States by 50%. I
Yes.
mean, I think this is Trump signaling for end of these conflicts by at least major superpowers, okay, or at least putting that on a back burner and concentrating on development, which gives me hope that I do believe he's looking at it in a much Jeffersonian and non-interventionalism philosophy, which what I believe our nation should always adhere to from the very beginning, because this is not of our business to be world's police to begin with, and
I'm
at the same
glad.
time. Thank you. But I do believe at the same time, there's this conflict in Ukraine and the peace treaty. Another reason why it was addressed with superpowers first is to say, look, listen, we want peace, we want stability. Maybe it's time we let these nations and these, smaller nations that are supporting due to their philosophical or political inclination, one way or another, conflict, maybe it's time for them to take the burden up on their shoulders. Look,
Yeah.
even if we do not achieve peace in Ukraine with the first, second set of negotiations, what is going to happen? If you allow these nations autonomy and pull the support from under them, this negotiation is done for to begin with. What are
Right.
they going to do? Again, they're going to send their sons, and in a lot of cases, daughters to this conflict. And then the citizens of their respective countries will feel the burden. And that is not going to stand for long. So, because they do not have the bandwidth like the superpowers do.
Yep.
So, I think this is like a very interesting global move towards acknowledging a world of unipolar world to where we can collaborate without trying to, be a hegemon or and not speak it on all fronts, from any of the superpowers or try to dominate the landscape. So this, the outcome of Ukrainian peace talk negotiations, I think it's largely a mute point at this point because everything that needed to be said has already been said by Hagases. I could never say his name right.
Except.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the outlook that I'm having on this. I think it is largely all but decided because without the support, it is largely a mute point. There will either be peace or the smaller nations will experience on their own skin what it is like, and peace will be accomplished one way or another.
Yeah, another outcome that I saw is like Mac once said, there's no way Ukraine could ever defeat Russia, and that's true. But the other problem is there may be no way that Russia can ever defeat Ukraine. Think about Afghanistan. Both Russia tried to take that over. They pulled out. We tried over how many years? We eventually pulled out. If the will of it depends on the will of the people, and I don't know what that is. Vlad, you would have a handle on that because even though 22% may support Zelensky, I don't know how many or what percentage of them support the war. You cannot support the president, but support your own national sovereignty. What do you think the Ukrainians, where do you think they are on that?
I think they're tired of seeing their sons die. I mean, we are talking, and you gotta look at the numbers with bias. Ukraine says Russia lost 1 million people, and they lost 500. Russia says we lost 600 and Ukraine lost 1.2. You always have to look at this with, some sort of inherent bias. But one thing you could say for certain is that definitely lost close to 1 million people on either side. And uh, I don't think it's sustainable for Ukraine simply because of their population. Because if you look at the population that they have, well, Ukraine has largely now been depopulated, and the majority of men over there are elderly and young or disabled.
That's right.
Okay, so which also leaves a very unique opportunity for European nations because European nations would definitely want Ukraine without this masculine influence because well Ukraine could be easily influenced at that point, debatably. But
Well,
if you're also looking at the territories like that inherently Russian territories, which by the way, let's not forget Crimea, which was inherently Russian territory too. So those territories are going to remain Russians. And even if Ukraine war would last for another decade or two, uh, Russia is digging themselves in more and more and better every day on that because they can afford to. For them,
yep,
it's a long game for this. So
yep.
whether or not it drags out, Russia doesn't really care. They got what they wanted. They got the access to the sea. What is it? I'm sorry.
Wonderful.
Exactly. And they returned inherently Russian territories back to their motherland, right?
And
So
here's what Europe is concerned about. The United States of America has oceans on both sides, so we're somewhat insulated from our enemies. The Europeans look at it like Ukraine is that buffer territory between Russia, who they consider to be their enemy, and their homeland. So they want Ukraine to be there as that buffer between Russia and them.
yeah, and you know what? Quite frankly, I have to agree with you, and it always baffled me because I think it's also beneficial for for the EU to have a buffer zone. So, NATO, the whole NATO conversation was largely a mystery to me. Why would you want somebody this close unless you are specifically trying to start a provocation? Now, the argument that I have heard was like, well, how about other nations that are NATO nations that are bordering Russia, okay, such as Finland and upper neighbors over there. But I'll tell you what, they do not pose a strategic threat to Russia as bad as Ukraine does,
Yes.
simply because the ICBM reach from, let's say, Finland to Moscow is over 500 miles. Ukraine is half of that.
Yep.
They could do something over there. Second of all, Finland and that entire part is landlocked. I mean, they would have to, if they were to amass any kind of defense, we're talking about a massive logistical operation, and that would take time, and Russia would know, and they would be able to prepare, and if need be, overrun that. So for them, that doesn't really pose as much of a threat as Ukraine, which is land rich and resources, open land, steppe, to where if and so much closer to Moscow if need be, for an all-out type of confrontation. So again, I agree with your point. I don't think this is a conflict that even United Nations want. But my point is, I believe United Nations right now are so, I wouldn't say brainwashed, but I say they have prolonged PTSD from dealing with bipolar United States that they do not know what to do.
Yeah.
Okay. And a lot of them are, and it's a constant struggle for this small um, lordships or small kingdoms struggling for power. Who's going to stay in there? And they're always looking up the well. The Trump thing is going to change. Democrats are going to be back in power. They're still acting under assumption that at some point, Daddy or their version of Daddy is going to come and save them.
Yeah.
Okay, so it is not until we allow them to figure out their own stuff on their own skin using their resources that we're going to come to any kind of consensus. And I think this is what largely is happening with this trilateral approach with Trump's policy on, like, let's get out of these never-ending wars and let them figure it out, because the moment the resources dry out, so will the conflicts. And if they do not, they will over time. But to your point, Russia is prepared to be there for a long time. They are. And they're just digging themselves better in a position because what they wanted, they got.
And very honestly, the United Nations is ineffective in doing any of these kinds of things, pro or con, stopping the war or beginning the war. I mean, they're just ineffective. And that's why Trump has suggested in the past that maybe the United States ought to get out of the UN.
Yeah. And financially too.
Yeah. Well, we got about 5 minutes left. So we're at the 5 minute mark. I don't know if there's any follow-up questions that you have, Mac.
Well, my only point is that, I can't understand. I mean, I understand the perspective of Zelensky that he needs to be at the table because it's his government that is being ignored. But the reality of it is, in my mind, that the people who need to be at the table are the Russians and the Americans. Because let's be honest, this is a proxy war, okay? And, I think the Europeans will go along with whatever, despite what they've said, I think the Europeans will go along with what Russia and the United States negotiates. And I think, very honestly, Trump is a better negotiator than Zelensky as far as getting Ukraine the best deal possible. I guess I'm
Right.
just frustrated to hear Zelensky say, if we're not at the table, we're not taking the deal. Because let me tell you what I believe. If Russia and the United States cut a deal, Zelensky will take it. He won't have a choice.
Well, let's say if he doesn't, what then? He doesn't
Yeah.
have the support.
What then? What does he do?
So, no, I appreciate it. Always is very refreshing to speak, and again, I'm a big proponent in non-interventionism, and I think this particular approach this time is the best approach we could take.
At one time, America had what they called the Monroe doctrine, which was under President Monroe, which was a long, long time ago. But basically, what the Monroe Doctrine was, hey, everybody, stay the hell out of the Americas and we'll stay out of your business. And somehow we've gotten away from that.
Well, we've gotten away from a lot of things. I do believe we were largely funding our nation through tariffs as well, and we got away from that.
Exactly
So,
right. Yeah. Prior to World War One, you betcha. Well, why do we have the war? Why did we have the Roaring Twenties? Because tariffs were paying for everything.
all right. And the burden was not on the citizen as much. You know what? I do believe we have a way to get back to that. And, there are a couple of things that I'm um, really interested in seeing how they develop in upcoming future here. Because during Trump's campaign, there was sometimes he mentioned, wouldn't it be wonderful if we eliminated the income tax? Well, you know what? Not a lot of people paid attention to that, but I did because technically speaking, we could. I mean, we
Yep.
could go back to the way those things were.
Yep.
Again, as for what you said in the Roaring Twenties, and
Yep.
if that's the case, looking just at the large implications of this, the entire IRS structure, all of this is going to be completely overhauled, cut down, and made like into just a small stockpile of stuff. But it's also going to impact the nonprofits, which are gigantic. Stuff like USAID is not going to happen again because this is gigantic tax shelters for
Yes.
people who, and you know what, another thing that it allowed to do, it allowed Democrats to have a monopoly on do-gooder perspective. I'm a do-gooder because I donate money. Well, let's see how much of a do-gooder you truly are, and if you have monopoly on that, if
Yeah.
you do not get your tax incentives, are
You
you
want to
still
be a
going to
do. You
donate?
want to be a do-gooder. Dig in your own pocket.
Exactly.
Pay
So I
for it
think this
yourself.
is, I think why I'm bringing this up, in our conversation pertaining to Russia and Ukraine, because I get to see a little bit of Trump's overall psychology on this.
Yeah.
Again, non-interventionism, pulling resources out from our enemies. While we do have domestic enemies, and people who've been abusing the system quite a bit, to fund our own nation's destruction and demise, as well as that of overseas. And I think it is very possible that we're going to be able to fix all of this by simply addressing where the money is coming from.
I
You
agree
believe
with
in
you.
something, you put
How,
your mouse
how
where
we doing
your
on time, Mike?
money where your mouse is worth.
Yep, we're under 1 minute.
Well,
Let's thank Vlad for being with us today, sharing his perspective on Russia and Ukraine. Clearly, a special insight. And I guess we should say, Mac and Mike
Oh.
out.